Mm.
Let me ask you, in terms of the story that I was talking about before, that Israel has failed to tell its story during this war. There's a debate within Israel about whether or not it's even possible for Israel to tell its story. There are many Israelis, including those in government, who say, "Who are you kidding? We're not going to win. No matter how we tell our story, we're not going to win anyone over. So the most important thing we can do is win the war. And when we win the war, if it takes 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is, once the war is over and the violence, the war fighting, the images of the war fighting winds down and it's off people's screens and it's not front of mind, Israel will be under less pressure and it can get back to the business of repairing its, reputation internationally." Where do you come down on that? Is just ignore the storytelling and try to win the war, or actually Israel's made this, a self-inflicted wound by not investing more in this?
I think I have a somewhat paradoxical superposition of those two views. Or it's kind of a barbell strategy. On the one hand, I think it's true that there's so much anti-Semitism and so much stigma associated with Israel itself as a country that in certain camps and probably at the UN, the PR war is unwinnable, and that Israel should defend itself without apology and recognize that the only thing that its real enemies will respect is strength. If they're going to respect anything at all, aspiring martyrs don't tend to respect even strength, but anyone else adjacent to them that's going to want to live in peace with a maximally strong Israel is going to respect only strength in the Muslim world. They're not going to respect empathy. They're not going to respect conforming to Western norms of human rights. They're going to respect just pure power from Israel. This is true of the Gulf states. This is true of any of the combatants. So I think Israel should be unapologetic about defending itself and just morally clear that it has a right to defend itself, and that it is fighting a death cult, right? That is anathema to everything that the people who are crying out for the rights of the Palestinians ostensibly want. All the LGBTQ groups who are in support of the Palestinians, the fact that they can't understand what Hamas really is you just sidelines them as actual conversants in any debate about the probity of this war. But on the other hand, I think Israel should have marshaled immense resources in fighting a war of ideas against all of its critics, but it should have emphasized the kinds of points that I want to emphasize in any conversation on this topic, which is Israel is fighting the same war for Western values and real humanitarian values and open societies and the rights of women and the rights of LGBTQ people and everyone else who we want to have rights. Israel's the only place in the Middle East where those rights are protected. And, you just have to look at the differing culture between, Gaza and Tel Aviv to understand that. And Netanyahu should have had a English language spokesman who could have spent endless hours on television having these debates, and I think they should have walked through every morally invidious disparity between the IDF and Hamas and between Israeli culture and Palestinian culture at every stage of this war. Just the logic of human shields and the logic of targeting civilians, and the fact that Israel simply doesn't do either of those things. And when civilians die in this war, it works in the Palestinian territories. It works completely against Israel's interests. So even if you were going to imagine them to be heartless bastards who are only concerned about how they're perceived on the world stage, well, still, even then, you have to know that Israel isn't trying to kill Palestinian children, right? That's just not the goal. Whereas conversely, it really is the goal of its enemies. And people should have pointed out endlessly that the moral illusions that creep in here. So, for instance, when you see all the death and destruction in Gaza, and decide on the basis of this horrible imagery that Israel is evil in prosecuting this war, what you have to recognize what you're not seeing, and you're not seeing the equivalent number of dead bodies being pulled out of rubble in Tel Aviv, because Israel has invested not in terror tunnels all these years. It has invested in missile defense and in bomb shelters for its own civilians, right? So it's not because of the restraint of Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah and Iran that there aren't an equivalent number of dead and injured children and women in the streets of Tel Aviv. That was absolutely intended on their part to produce that kind of carnage. It's because Israel has defended itself. So when you hold up the images of Gaza and you say there's no equivalent death and destruction on the Israeli side, therefore Israel's in the wrong, you are rewarding Hamas for using its own non-combatants as human shields and maximizing the death and destruction on its own side, and you're demeaning Israel for having successfully protected a civilian population. And someone needs to be able to walk through that time and again on television and online, and do all the moral math when it's not being done on TikTok by all the agents, the apologists for Hamas. And the fact that Israel hasn't invested in that more intelligently is a real shortcoming, and that should have been done.
Why? So beyond that, beyond the anti-Semitism that we were talking about earlier, beyond what's going on in Islamist communities in Europe that we talked about earlier, and beyond Israel not explaining what you're talking about right here, beyond all of that, why do you think Hamas's story caught on? I mean, we talked about Israel's story, right? And Israel's version of events, which I agree with the version you just described, that Israel should have been communicating. Hamas's story caught on.
Yeah.
Its version of events caught on.
Well, it's
Beyond
caught on. It's of a piece with every other variant of this that has nothing to do with Israel. I mean, why did John le Carré and Germaine Greer and the rest of the confused intelligentsia in 1989 castigate Salman Rushdie for having the temerity to write critically about Islam, right? I mean, so there's a direct threat to their own intellectual and artistic freedom. A fatwa hurled at a fellow novelist, in this case, and he immediately is forced into hiding. He's got translators being murdered as far away as Japan, if memory serves. And you have liberal intellectuals blaming him for the fatwa. You had a former U.S. president, Jimmy Carter, publishes an op-ed in the New York Times. He said something appropriately critical of the Iranian regime, but he also castigated Rushdie for having injured the Muslims the world over, whose sacred beliefs have really been trespassed against. It's completely insane. It's utterly masochistic. It's just, again, you're feeding the crocodile, and it's directly at odds with the very principles you have to maintain your hard-won freedoms in an open society. And for some reason, left of center, people can't see this. And I mean, there's a few lenses thrown up over this which are genuinely confusing. One is the Palestinians are viewed as the people of color in the region being oppressed by white-skinned colonialists, as though that made any sense in the current conflict. Introduce them to an Ethiopian Jew fighting for the IDF. That would even be insufficient to make the point, given the level of confusion left of center here. But it's mapping the African American experience onto the Middle East is, to a first approximation, what has confused everyone on a college campus in the U.S. But it's beyond that. It's beyond anti-Semitism, and it's beyond an animus toward Israel as a state. It's a hatred of the West. It's the belief that everything that happens on this front, of a jihadist or Islamist flavor, is the result of Western aggression, Western misadventures, Western colonialism, Western greed for oil. It's all chickens coming home to roost. 9/11 was that. Charlie Hebdo was that. I mean, you have absolute morons, who are the darling of alternative media, at least. People like Glenn Greenwald, right? Who gets the scoop of the century handed to him by Edward Snowden, and is the darling of every anti-establishment person, left or right. Who does he blame on the day after the Charlie Hebdo massacre? He blames the cartoonists, right? I mean, this is the masochism and the self-criticism. If you want to find the guru of all of this, it's still Noam Chomsky, right? I mean, there's nothing that has ever been done to America or to the West that America and the West has not earned through its own callousness and avarice and direct coercion of other beleaguered people who had all these awful things done to them first. And this comes back to a point which I've never heard better. I think I made this on your podcast last time around, but it's worth remembering. I mean, I've never heard this point made better than Paul Berman made it in his book Terror and Liberalism, specifically with respect to the perception of Israel, which is when they see, and I think he was speaking specifically of the Second Intifada here, when you see people, kind of an endless supply of suicide bombers, people doing the unthinkable and celebrating themselves for doing the unthinkable, right? You have the families of religious maniacs who have just blown themselves up in pizza parlors, targeting children and teenagers specifically. And you see celebration in the streets over this, and you ask yourself the question: what could have caused a community to behave in ways that should be unimaginable, right? And you think, well, people everywhere are the same. They all want the same things. They all have the same. Everyone just loves their kids precisely the way I love my kids. The only thing that explains this is how terribly they've been mistreated by the Israelis, right? The onus is on the victims in this case, because that's the only explanation that a rational secular person can understand, because they simply don't understand the worldview of a jihadist or of a wider culture that shares the worldview of a jihadist. And that's what Israel is, that's the very steep hill Israel, in terms of the war of ideas, that's the very steep hill they've had to climb. And they have not been making the requisite efforts to climb it, in my view. And it really has to be done, because, again, this is a fight that every open society has to wage against this particular version of its antithesis, which is jihadism.